Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
So glad you're with us for this very special edition of the Three Martini Lunch. As you know, Jim Garrity was away for a little more than 2 weeks. Went back to Ukraine. This was his third trip to Ukraine. And then while he was over there, he and his team ended up in Syria for a number of days. And so we're going to get into all of that and also what it was like to be in Ukraine with so many major breaking stories about Ukraine happening while they were there. And we'll also get into some just crazy moments, which are inevitable in a trip like this, especially over a span of that length. And so, Jim, as I mentioned, you'd already been to Ukraine twice. And so you decided to go back. So what in the world were you thinking in terms of a third trip to Ukraine, and then how in the heck did you get over to Syria by the time this whole thing was over?
Yeah, well, listeners, if you're sensing a bit of genuine disbelief in Greg's voice, part of it is that I did not tell him, or really almost anybody else stateside, that I was going to the Syria part of the trip. A little bit of that was operational security. No one can ambush you if they don't know where you're going to be. Also, by the way, Greg, I want to thank you for referring to my team like I'm the leader. Like I have my own dangerous clique or A-team, yes. And we all have our rogues with our abilities. What does Jim do? He writes a lot. He doesn't have any linguistic skills, doesn't know the ground, doesn't know his way around, but he's really good at making funny quips when the situation goes bad. So that's why we keep him around. Greg Columbus attended the 2024 Garrity family pre-Christmas party, and that was actually the night the Assad regime fell. And someday when they're comfortable being out there, I'll talk about my buddies who I go out there with. But you may recall one of my buddies was treating the fall of the Assad regime like the way I would treat a Jets Super Bowl victory. Just the most, this is the greatest news ever. And a whole bunch of my other friends like, well, this is great. Assad was a real bastard, used chemical weapons a whole bunch of times, was absolutely brutal. But, well, you never know what's going to come next. And out of that conversation, out of those developments in the weeks afterwards, the third trip to Ukraine had been in the works planning for a while. And my buddies are like, well, what if we went over to Syria and just saw how the new government is working, how things are going a couple months after the toppling of the regime. And for everyone wonder what my reaction to that was. What are you talking about? What, Ukraine's not dangerous enough? But eventually they gave me a sedative, and I came around to the idea of, how many times in life do you get to see the top of the country? We've just gotten rid of a guy who ruled with an iron fist. We've had 13 years of just probably the bloodiest and most horrible civil war you could imagine, with entire neighborhoods of cities just leveled. And some of the pictures I put in the Morning Jolt earlier this week, they are figuring out what they're going to be next. The guy in charge of the government over there, formerly Jelani, was formerly in Al-Qaeda. And then he decided to get tired of Al-Qaeda and he got into ISIS, probably the only world leader who has been detained in a U.S. camp in Iraq. There's a whole bunch of reasons to be very wary about this guy, or even beyond wary. But since the toppling of the Assad regime, he's been saying the right things. And one of the things I was able to do, talking to folks like the patriarch of the Syrian church and one of the last 7 Jews in Syria, is, so how's the new regime treating you? And I think we can say 3 months in, nothing's been terribly screwed up yet. That is not necessarily to say things are great. I'll talk a bit more about this later in the podcast, but there was just kind of this sense that there was a remarkable things happening. It was overtaken by domestic political events and obviously the war in Ukraine. And so there was kind of this sense of like, hey, and my buddies assured me we would be safe every step of the way. At no point did I feel like I was at a direct life-threatening danger. But there were a lot of stressful moments and a lot of points of, hey, how are we going to get from point A to point B? How safe is this? How are we getting out of the country when the way we were supposed to was not available? This was, as you alluded to, there are a lot of things. You need to be really flexible and adaptable for these things. I had a remarkable experience. Glad that I had it. I've wrote a bit about earlier this week. I'll be writing more about it, both at National Review and the Post. But this was an intense one, so I will not be going back out at any place dangerous for a good long time.
All right, but before we move on, any specifics, any particular moments in your mind where you were kind of in that personal narration of, I bet you're wondering how I got into this position?
Yes, over and over again. But Idlib, is basically jihadist metropolis. In fact, I bought a hat at a store called the Jihadist Backpack. And that's a direct translation of it. My buddies were, I have good buddies who basically the more dangerous the situation is, like, ooh, let's touch. No, let's go as close as we can, well beyond my personal sense of risk management. Often they persuade me. Every once in a while I get to play the voice of reason, and we do not. Or very often their attitude is, let's see if we can do this. Can we fly a drone over the Russian base at Tartus? And the answer is no. Can we go in and check out the Russian air base at Latakia? And the answer is no. But these Syrian guards outside are very chatty about what it's like to have Russians there and how they don't like them. I spoke to more people who are pretty much jihadists than I ever expected to in my life. And Greg, they're just the friendliest, amiable terrorists you'd ever want to meet. They hate the Russians and they hate the Assad regime. So instantly you can find some things to bond about. There were like plenty of moments where I'm like, how did I get here? What am I doing? Am I dreaming this? It just got weirder and more surreal over and over again. So it's one of the reasons I'm glad. Again, I am in one piece. Here are all my limbs. Everything turned out okay. But you never know if things are going to turn out until you're okay, until it's wheels up and you're out of the airspace.
Yes, I'm sure that was very relieving. And I'm guessing you probably have some material for future novels, perhaps several of them.
Yes. Yeah. Greg, people who read Dueling Six Demons probably noticed that the itinerary of the characters included Ukraine and Taiwan and the not really a country Transnistria breakaway region of Moldova. And the description of the USSR canteen in that book, yes, that's, like what happens to Alec in these stories very often is a reflection of things that have happened to me on these journeys. And I think it's a safe bet that when I finally find the time to finish book 7, right now I'm calling it Against Seven Enemies, but we'll see how things shake out with that. You'll probably see some sections in Syria and Ukraine that were reflective of this trip.
Absolutely amazing. And I know we're just scratching the surface in terms of some of those high blood pressure moments. So while Jim was quickly moving around to different volatile spots on the map, let's talk about Fast Growing Trees. Did you know that Fast Growing Trees is the biggest online nursery in the United States with thousands of different plants and more than 2 million happy customers? Fast Growing Trees offers a wide selection of plants, from fruit and privacy trees to shrubs, all tailored to your climate and your space.
You don't need to have a yard or a lot of space. You can grow lemon, avocado, olive, and fig trees inside your home on top of the wide variety of houseplants that are available. The experts at Fast Growing Trees curate thousands of plants, so you can find the perfect fit for your specific climate, location, and needs.
And don't forget, with easy online ordering, quick delivery, and expert support, including landscaping advice and their Alive and Thrive guarantee, your plants will arrive healthy and ready to thrive. We're looking forward to our next plant coming from Fast Growing Trees. We've already had the Monstera plant, we've had a fig plant, we've had lemon, we've had spices that have ended up in our meals, and oh my goodness, Mrs. Columbus does an amazing job with that. So this spring, get up to 50% off select plants at fastgrowingtrees.com/martini. Plus, use the code Martini at checkout for an extra 15% off your first purchase. Visit fastgrowingtrees.com/martini and use the code Martini. Now's the perfect time to plant. Offer valid for a limited time. Terms apply. All right, Jim, on to our second martini now, probably classified as the bad martini. This is, again, your third time that you've been to Ukraine. I'm guessing it's the trip that has most coincided with banner headlines as it relates to the Ukraine policy, in terms of Trump's tweet about Zelensky, referring to him as a dictator and wanting new elections. Obviously, the Oval Office dust-up, although based on my mental calendar, you might have been out of Ukraine by that time.
No, I was there. I was there.
Oh, you were at that time?
Actually, no, I'm sorry. You're right. You're correct. I had just gotten into Syria then.
So as this is all playing out, and Trump is obviously speaking about the desire for peace, and Zelensky's got his priorities at this meeting, how does this play in Ukraine for the people that you're dealing with, as well as just the regular citizens on the street?
Yeah, well, I did speak to one American friend of Ukraine. There was a very large defense tech conference in Kyiv the first couple of days that I was there. And so all kinds of Americans. David Petraeus, former CIA director and leader of the surge in Iraq, was one of the guest speakers at this conference. I didn't get a chance to talk to him for very long, but it was still nice to, if he's here, you figure you're fairly safe. Mostly, I would point out, like the conference at the hotel had magnetometers, but beyond that, there wasn't a lot of, I could just walk right in. And my buddies and I are thinking, What if the Russians decided to try to bomb this site? And then it dawned on me. The reason they weren't going to bomb this site is because it's much more valuable to the Russians as an intelligence source. They want to listen into this meeting. They don't want to destroy it. And in fact, at one point, one of the other attendees of the conference, an American investor, said, there's a woman in the corner who's allegedly on her phone chatting, but she's holding up her phone in a way to watch everyone. So we're pretty sure she's a Russian spy. Now, Greg, when I say blonde woman in the corner is a Russian spy, what are you picturing?
The Americans? I don't know.
Well, okay, let's face it. The image of the Russian spy in American pop culture is usually some gorgeous woman named Ivana who's, an absolute honey trap and who's going. I regret to inform you, this Russian woman was very mundane. Deliberately walked by her on the way to the bathroom, and I got to tell you, we have drawn down the Russian economy, we have drawn down the Russian defenses, but what's even more, apparently we have drawn down the Russian supply of babes, and it just. I know technically in intelligence you don't want to stand out, but just what a disappointment. All trap, no honey. It was not the first time on this trip. The highly touted Russian activities were a little underwhelming. But anyway, so apparently we're at that one. So I wrote to an American who's I've met before, who's a strong supporter of the Ukrainian cause, and he said he had spoken to a Ukrainian official who was ready to commit seppuku, which is the Japanese ritual suicide. There were some who were panicked, but most of the Ukrainians that I spoke to, it's bad news. Trump saying they want to at least temporarily suspend aid. The Oval Office meltdown, all Trump's willingness to call Zelensky a dictator, but not Putin. All of this is really bad news. But they kind of have this, I don't know whether it's Eastern European fatalism or just a sense of all kinds of things have gone wrong in this war. They were supposed to get, Russian troops in Kyiv within 3 days, and we marked the 3-year anniversary of the war. So there's kind of crap, what else can go wrong? Shrug of the shoulders and continuing on. And for anybody out there who thinks, because we're cutting off assistance, the Ukrainians will have no choice but to come to the negotiating table and sign a deal with Vladimir Putin and trust him. That is not the Ukrainian mentality right now. I suppose it could change in the future, but their attitude is, if we have to fight on without America, we're going to do it. If we have to do this with sticks and stones, we're going to do that. They're exhausted. Do not. I don't want to downplay how much they hate what the war has forced upon them. They hate the loss of the casualties, the altering. You can see it in their faces. You can see it in their eyes. You can hear it in their voices. They are, indeed exhausted. But that does not mean they're okay, we're going to let 20% of our country be ruled by the Russians, and we're going to accept a deal that's going to require us to disarm and all that stuff. I'm surprised how often I have to explain this to American audiences, because I'd like to think that's the way we would react to anyone who attempted to conquer part of our country. No, we're not interested in negotiating. We're going to take every last. How dare you? How dare you commit the atrocities that you have? How dare you continue to rain rockets upon our cities? Also, weirdness on this trip. I heard more in Kyiv in terms of air defenses and air attacks than I'd ever heard before. Louder and clearer than I ever had before. And we're staying at the same hotel that I'd stayed at the previous couple trips. Thankfully, nothing fell down. And for those wondering, when you cross the border, the odds of something heavy and Russian falling on your head increase from 0, which is the ideal, which is really where you want to be, to slightly above 0, which is not great, but also the odds of you being in the wrong place at the wrong time. As I've mentioned, the air raid sirens and air raid alerts go off, and I have the thing where on the phone it tells you, this is the district where and they're getting nice and specific. We have seen a drone in your area. There is Russian air forces entering your area, stuff like that. Nobody goes to the air raid shelters anymore, or at least very rarely. On this trip, what makes it stand out, I had been on the other side of the Dnipro River, but I'd really not gone to the east. And what's going to make this trip unforgettable were that I spent a considerable amount of time in the eastern part of the country and far north part of the country, much closer to the front. I should emphasize, I am not at the front. I posted a picture of myself in the body armor that my traveling buddies said, if we're going to go out there, you really want to have this. By the way, thank you to National Review and Washington Post for their generous donations to the Don't Let Jim Get Shot Fund. If you're in the market for body armor, I can recommend a great place. The quality of the work is fantastic, but let's face it, body armor costs a lot more. And by the way, this is not something you want to skimp on. This is the one area where I'm perfectly willing to pay premium prices. So, my buddies are telling me this, and I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit freaked out by that, and I try it on, and it's, it's heavy, but it's good. It's going to protect you, but I'm like, oh God, I hope I never have to use this. I ended up wearing it for really one day. I can't. People have wondered, when you do this, Jim, how much protection do you get, or how much do you have to cooperate with the Ukrainian government? Generally, minimally. But the Ukrainian government is, and the Ukrainian military is great. Or if you're like, hi, I'm here, I'm an American, I want to write a story. They'll put you in places where you can tell the stories. And so we were going up to the northern part of closer to the front. In fact, I can't give you the exact location. Because they were very touchy about that. But it's near Kursk Oblast in Russia, which is where 6 months ago the Ukrainians blasted through the Russian lines and actually occupied Russian territory. Now, I want to be very clear here. I did not enter Russian territory. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is for Western reporters who do enter Russian territory, when they find out about that, the Russian government puts your name on an Interpol list saying you've illegally entered the country. Greg, you've been over my house. You've met my family. My life is stressful enough without appearing on an Interpol list. And there are a lot of places in this country I'd like to travel, in this world I'd like to travel. So I'd like to not have to deal with any of that. So no, I did not cross the border. But what I did have the opportunity to do, and I wrote about this in the Washington Post, was go to a hospital. And again, the Ukrainian government's like, you can write about this, but do not disclose the location. So I'll just say it's somewhere near the old border. And what they allowed me to talk to there were a bunch of Russian little old ladies who had been in Kursk Oblast. They were hit by Russian shells. I don't think it was deliberate. I think this is just the usual bad aim of the Russians. And their houses collapsed on them. And the Ukrainian soldiers who are occupying Kursk Oblast came to the scene, dug them out. By the way, there are still drone attacks. They're still firing. This is still an active war zone. After a day or two, managed to get them back across the border into Ukrainian territory and took them to this hospital in Ukrainian territory. The exact location they asked me not to disclose. And for people who wonder, is there, Ukrainian censorship if you're reporting, Jim? When the Ukrainians tell me if you report that, it's going to get somebody killed, I don't report it. As much as I want to give my readers the most complete story possible, I also don't want anybody to die because of anything I've written. And I hope no one finds that to be too much of a moral compromise. But these Russian little old ladies, there was a translator. They reminded me in some ways of my own grandmothers. They were in rough shape. They had like you're in a house and your ceiling caves in. They had legs with like a half dozen pins in them each. They were in rough shape, but they were chatty. And they wanted to tell people what had happened to them, and they were very great. They didn't say anything about geopolitics. They didn't say anything about Putin or Zelensky or Russia. But the Ukrainian soldiers had saved their lives, and the Ukrainian doctors had, treated them so that maybe they have a shot of walking again. And I think the life expectancy of a little lady in a collapsed house with broken legs is not great. So here we have Ukrainians operating in Russian territory, saving Russian citizens and bringing them back across. And they said they'd been able to at least talk to their families and stuff. I described them by their first name, quoted them. The Ukrainians asked me not to reveal which village they were from. It was a remarkable moment. And that hospital was busy. And this is not after some particular large offensive or anything. This is just life this close to the war. Ukrainian soldiers coming in with, bleeding through their bandages, and again, you could see the cost of the war in the doctors and nurses and patients' faces, and hear it in their voices. So it's funny. I told somebody this, and they're like, "Oh God, that must have been so hard." Honestly, I felt privileged to be able there and to be in this extraordinary situation. I was very aware of the fact that Russians tend to hit hospitals. I think there's been like 700 since the start of the war. The other weird thing is that so I'm talking to these, and by the way, were these women coached or anything like that? These women are in a hospital bed, 70 something, and if you've ever had any of your grandmothers, that had the attitude. I don't think these women had any patience for coaching for anybody. They nearly got killed, and they're thrilled to pieces to be alive and to be able to talk to their families. And so, if they were coached, they fooled me. But I think the circumstances are what they are, which is that they're alive in Ukraine because of the Ukrainians, not because their houses were, at least the ceiling collapsed, if not completely destroyed, because of the bad aim of the Russians. So now again, because talking to an American journalist could get them in trouble, I did not go into great bit of detail of their identities, and I'm hoping the Russian government would not pick on Russian little old ladies, and I hope these people are able to get to their homes, but we'll see how that shakes out. We went on to Kharkiv. We went on to Dnipro. Both of those are significantly closer to the front. Both of those cities, I spent some time in shopping malls just because it was a convenient location for a couple of the interviews I did. in Kharkiv, I met with an American aid worker, former cop, who is very interested in trauma care and how to, Save One More Life is the name of his charitable organization. His nickname is Twitch. He's got a real name, but everybody calls him Twitch. And he says, just spend 5 seconds with me, you'll see it. He has Tourette's syndrome, but is otherwise a phenomenal communicator. Greg, I've met some extraordinary people over in Ukraine, but Twitch was just the kind of guy where, like, give this guy a talk show when all is said and done, because he's got just so much zest for life. He loves what he's done. He spoke very openly about his faith. And he said he heard God saying, you should be over there helping people. And he was very open about the fact that he didn't want to do that. And his wife didn't want to do that. And his coworkers like, that's a really bad idea, man. But it was really remarkable to talk to somebody who was that open about the faith and the degree to which they felt called. On the site, you can find some pictures. I tried to quote him as much as possible, just because you want to talk about a guy who is exactly where he needs to be, doing what God wants him to do, making the world a better place. And he treats trauma care. He treats, when somebody's bleeding really badly, how you keep somebody alive when they're in a life and death situation. He's done all kinds of classes for Ukrainian military, Ukrainian civilian, even teenagers and kids. And so Twitch, if you're listening to this, God bless you. I think you're doing exactly what God wants you to do. People ask me, why do I go on these trips? Moments like that. Look, I love covering U.S. politics. I love what we talk about most days in this podcast. But every now and then you just feel this sense of like, maybe that's where I'm supposed to be at that exact moment. And only at that moment, because now I'm back and safe and I feel a lot better about that.
No, it's fascinating to read your excellent reporting in the Morning Jolt on this, and folks can obviously go back over the past couple of weeks and catch up if you haven't, although I have been regularly telling you all to keep up with your required reading, so hopefully most of you have done that. But yes, obviously we look at this conflict for the most part from a 10,000-foot view. It makes sense to do that most of the time, but then when you can actually zoom in and see the impact on people there, the people who are drawn to the conflict for the right reasons, and kind of filtering the headlines that we see through what you've been able to see on the ground for us. And so,
yeah, just one last detail I suddenly remembered regarding my bulletproof vest and helmet that I guess I now have. So, now if I want to go into like bad neighborhoods in DC or something, I'm properly prepared. So the company sold it to me, and they said I identified myself as a reporter and stuff. So it's black, it's not camouflage, and they sell it to me with the Velcro the Velcro sign saying press. And one of my traveling buddies says, you don't want take that off. You don't want to have that on there. I'm like, why? He's like, the Russians interpret that as shoot this guy first. And the reason is, if you kill a journalist, by the way, there are plenty of journalists who've been killed in this war, sometimes accidentally, just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but sometimes the belief is deliberately. If you kill a journalist, that's a very big story. But what's also, it makes the media organizations very reluctant to let their journalists go into that particular location, which means the Russians know there will be zero media scrutiny of whatever they do in that area. So, yes, I took the Velcro off, and I still have it. If I go to places where it is okay to have that on, I will. But just like people ask me, like, how risky is it to go over there? And I don't want to emphasize, I'm not playing soldier. I'm not pretending. There's nothing Rambo about what I'm doing here. I'm a guy out there with a recorder and a pen and a pad, and just to ask people, what their stories have been in this war so far. But I'm also not ignorant of the fact that the risk is above zero. And that's one of the reasons why I really love doing it. I really love coming back in one piece, and I don't intend to do this. I'm not about to go out and try to be Arthur Kent Scud Stud and completely change my... I have been accused, in light of our next martini, of having a midlife crisis.
I wouldn't chalk it up to that. I think you found it intriguing, and you were also kind of talked into it. So we'll get into that in just a second. But you know that running your small business is complicated, and there's a lot on your plate, even on a good day. And that's before things outside of your control could impact you. But for more than 38,000 businesses, they've future-proofed their operations with NetSuite by Oracle, the leading cloud ERP platform. It integrates key business functions like accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one seamless system, ensuring businesses are ready for the future.
With actionable data at your fingertips, you can anticipate trends and respond faster to opportunities. And closing your books in days instead of weeks means you spend less time on past reports and more on focusing on future growth. This efficiency lets you shift your attention from historical tasks to strategic initiatives that drive business forward.
I hear it from small business experts. I hear it from small business owners. There's so much on your plate. Free yourself up to focus on what's most important and what you are best at. So let NetSuite by Oracle take care of these vital responsibilities for you. Meanwhile, you can download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/martini. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/martini. That's netsuite.com/martini. All right, Jim, on to our final martini now in this special edition, and that is your trip to Syria. You've been to Ukraine now 3 times, your first trip to Syria. Explain how the decision was made to go to Syria, how you got there, and what you learned there.
That part was pre-planned. It was very much, I didn't trip and fall into Syria. I very much knew I was going there.
Okay.
And in case you're this was ironically probably the easiest getting in and out of Ukraine I've ever had. There is a border post in which you walk across. There actually is no road. The road ends. There's a border station. You get, I flew into Krakow. We drove to this in a cab, and you just get all your suitcases and you go in. You check out of Poland. Go about maybe 200 yards, and then there's a border station for Ukraine. Show them your passport. Check everything in, and then you're there. And then there's buses and cabs and stuff like that on that one. And so, as I described, I think we waited. God, it was like half a day the first time we were trying to drive over. There's often very long waits at the vehicular border posts. Some of this is inspection. Some of this is making sure this isn't military age Ukrainian men attempting to leave the country, things like that. If you have an American passport, people are very casual and cool, and in fact, really happy to see you in that country. So we drove back across the border, spent a night in Warsaw, Poland, and then flew to Istanbul, stayed overnight there, and then flew from Istanbul to Damascus. Turkish Airlines. By the way, the entry visa for Syria right now is $200 for American. I was traveling with some of my buddies are British. $150. I don't understand why we got screwed over, and it's an extra $50, but fine, whatever.
Unfair tariffs, Jim. Unfair tariffs.
Probably. You'd think all the colonialism, they'd have bigger gripe with the Brits, but no, that's fine. So, head into Damascus. We spent about 2 days there. As I mentioned, spoke to the patriarch of the Orthodox Church out there. As I mentioned, one of the last 7 Jews in Syria. The Wall Street Journal and NPR and a couple other folks have done some actually reports on these minuscule Jewish community in Syria. This new government allowed a group of rabbis to come in, reopen one of the closed synagogues there, and conduct services. The gentleman I spoke to was probably, I'm going to guess, in his early 60s. I believe he's the youngest of the 7 Jews in Syria. So they're not on the verge of a massive comeback. But by the way, I thought that was a good sign that they were open to having these. There are more. I believe there's like 3 times as many synagogues that are effectively closed in Syria than there are Jews in the country. So no one should be expecting this. But there's the dynamic where people say that the smaller a minority is, the less they're a threat to the majority, and thus the majority finds it easier to be tolerant of them. This guy is a local celebrity, and all of his friends and neighbors love him. What's he going to do? Take over the country with his other 6 buddies? So in that sense, with the question of is there anti-Semitism in Syria, they're very laid back about this guy because he's not no particular threat to them. I would not say that there are warm and fuzzy feelings about Israel, although I would point out that the new leader has said the new Syrian government has no interest in fighting Israel. That's because they're just recovering from a devastating civil war, and they don't have, they're integrating the militias into a new Syrian army. Their economy is an absolute disaster. By the way, so it's not that they're it's not that credit cards don't exist, but they are cut off from the rest of the world financial system because of the sanctions that were put on the Assad regime. And by the way, I think the new government does have something of a fair argument. Look, all those sanctions are for whatever Assad did. We just overthrew that guy. Judge us on what we've done. Don't judge us on what the old regime did. There is genuinely a currency crisis. People walk around. I don't know if it's quite Weimar Republic where people are walking around with wheelbarrows, but people walk around with giant wads of cash because there's not a lot of electronic banking or credit cards or stuff like that, including very successful businessmen who are taking out multi-inch wads of cash. The largest denomination in Syria right now is worth 30 cents. So imagine you want to buy something for $10, you need 30 of these bills. Not the largest denomination, but one of the bill faces, by the way, has Bashir Assad's face on it. Now, you might be thinking, why are they doing it this way? Well, it turns out Syria has never printed its own currency. It has always been dependent upon Russia for doing it. And Russia, apparently, go figure, is starting to get a little squirrely and persnickety about delivering the notes that they need to keep the Syrian economy going. There's a U.S. company that will print currency for you. And there's a whole bunch in Europe. You don't have to keep working with them. And in fact, to say to the Syrians, you don't have to keep paying the Russians, who are allied with the regime you just overthrew, to keep printing bill faces that have the face of the guy you just overthrew on them. That would, at minimum, put a palm tree on it. But it just seems like the sort of, it feels really insulting. You're like, screw this guy. But here's an Assad. Can you break it? Can you make change for me? This is why I go there, because I think the Financial Times did a story on it. But otherwise, like, our coverage of Syria just doesn't get this kind of like, how are they going to function? By the way, real pressure on their economy, because like they basically haven't had much of a functioning economy for a very long time. Interestingly, one of the gentlemen I spoke to, a Syrian-American businessman who has come back to kind of help with this, what they're calling a national dialogue. Think of it as like a precursor to a constitutional convention. They have this basic, provisional government in place. For what it's worth, the new president says they think they'll have presidential elections in 4 to 5 years, but that right now they just don't have any of the infrastructure that wouldn't be keeping with international standards for that sort of thing. I should point out, he would start out in Al-Qaeda, goes to ISIS, and he breaks with Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, because Baghdadi wants to be in charge of his forces. So it's not exactly like he had a principle. Hey, with ISIS, we're doing, are we the baddies, as they do in that British sketch? There are skulls on our caps. Maybe we're not so
tactical, not ideological, is what.
Right? Yeah, it was very much. But he is, for at least so far, saying he intends. He's like, the Christians have been in Syria for thousands of years. There's no reason for us to think about getting rid of them. The Syrian Orthodox Church patriarch pointed out to us that used to have about 1.5 million Christians, about 500,000 left during the Civil War. They're hoping they come back. Let's say cautious optimism is how I would describe the patriarch's attitude towards the new regime. They're not loving it, but so far, if there's they've been invited, there's an interest in dialogue. I think the overall sense of a lot of these people who are participating in this national dialogue, and they got everybody except the Kurds to show up to this conference and participate. Nobody wants a war. Everybody's exhausted. Everybody's lost so much. Everybody's like, it's time to rebuild. And so everybody has a general consensus on that. How you do that is a much harder process. And there were some people who griped that this recent gathering was a lot of happy talk or a lot of rhetoric and not a lot of specifics about how they're going to go about doing that. They desperately want U.S. sanctions to be lifted. I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. And by the way, there's when Assad fell, Trump said on Truth Social, "This is not our war. We're not getting involved," which I think is a perfectly legitimate assessment. But I point out the war's over. There's a little bit of fighting here and there, but generally the civil war has ended, and there's a regime in place, and that regime doesn't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon. This regime hates ISIS. ISIS was on the other side in this war. This regime hates the Russians. So I think there's some areas of cooperation that are potential there. It's going to be a long time before we have, very much trust but verify. And I've heard people say, don't trust, verify, and then verify again, which I think is reasonable. Mm-hmm. But there's also a question of, do we recognize these guys as a legitimate government? Do we allow them to reopen an embassy in the United States? Do we reopen our embassy there? Do we start a dialogue to see where there are parts of cooperation? I don't expect any of these things to happen very quickly. But I do know that the Russians and Chinese very much want to talk to this new regime, and Russia would really love to keep its bases there. By the way, according to the border guards, who I said were so chatty, there are about 2,000 to 3,000 Russians at Latakia Air Base. You can see the flag from where we are. I took a picture. It wasn't great, but they are all confined to their part of the base. And by the way, these guards are like the guys who beat them in the war. They're all convinced they won the Super Bowl. And they're very, almost gloating about it. They're confined to this area and the naval base at Latakia. And if they go from one to the other, they get a military escort by the Syrians. Outside, as I mentioned, we were not allowed into Tartus Naval Base with the Russians. Go figure. They didn't want American journalists walking around there. But we did see a giant white blimp airship floated off there. And I looked it up. I'm not an aviation expert. I could be wrong about this. But there's a type of airship that does all kinds of electronic surveillance sort of stuff. So I believe that's what's there watching on that stuff. So I immediately went home and smashed my cell phone. No, by the way, I took considerable, both in Ukraine and in Syria, took considerable, let's just call cybersecurity hygiene, shutting it off, putting it in Faraday bags and stuff like that when you're in sensitive areas. So the team I'm with is, oh God, now, Greg, you got me talking about my team again. Yeah, my team. The guys I travel with are very conscious about that sort of thing and try to do their best to make sure nobody's listening in on all of my vacation pictures and all the secrets that are on my phone. But hey, you never want that kind of stuff going on. So in Damascus, walking around the streets, and let's face it, everybody I'm traveling with is about as pallid as I am. We don't necessarily blend in. In fact, you've met some of these friends, Greg. We don't just not blend in. We kind of stand out. The motley crew coming through the streets of Damascus. But I would say almost a whole bunch of people under age 30, when they saw a bunch of pallid Western-looking guys speaking English, would stop and say, you're American, you're British, welcome to Syria. We are so glad you're here. And one guy who spoke pretty good English said, look, Arab culture is a culture based on hospitality. And for 13 years during the Civil War, we haven't had any visitors. We are so happy to see Westerners coming here. I can't say plan your next family vacation to Syria quite yet. I believe you're going to want to watch the situation carefully. But there were plenty of people in the capital city who were really eager were thrilled to see foreigners visiting. Idlib, jihad metropolis, maybe not so much. That was definitely a odd experience. I would point out, though, when we go over there, we travel with a translator and not one but two drivers. I'm pretty sure our translator and one of our drivers are dating, but they didn't say so. So I'll just say, but one of our drivers was a woman, and a woman who was uncovered, did not have a veil, did not wear her headscarf. So we go to Idlib, which is definitely one of the most Islamist, culturally conservative parts we visited. This was the part of the trip where I think I felt the most unnerved. And very much like we were standing out. And when she was driving through the streets, I could definitely tell people were staring, and people were kind of jostling and pointing and stuff. It's conceivable. They said that for some people, this is the first time they've seen a woman driving a car. No one confronted us. No one made an issue. No one yelled or something like that. But it definitely stood out as unusual. And as part of me was like, we asked her, "Are you feeling uncomfortable?" She's like, "Well, I definitely feel people are noticing, but I think people should see this." So this was entirely her call, and she wanted to do it this way. And a little later on, we're talking about this more. And so I should point out, all throughout Syria, we're going through checkpoints. Checkpoints armed by guys who you probably would have thought were bad guys in one of the early seasons of 24. Masks, AKs, ammo belts, fatigues, all that kind of stuff. But almost the time, they're all waving us through. They're very. Sometimes they'd say, "Where are you going?" And our driver would answer, and they'd say, "Okay, sure." No incidents, no confrontations. But then our translator explained that for a lot of these guys, because of their belief system, they don't want to interact with a woman any more than they have to. And they certainly aren't going to touch her. So this was a very deliberate strategy on the part of our translator and driver to have a woman driving the car, where for a high percentage of the guards, this is not going to be worth the trouble. Just let them go on through. So in that sense, we had no incident. That said, Idlib Idlib made Ukraine look like a walk in the park. And so... Oh, and I probably should do the final. So to give you a sense of how you need to be flexible and adaptable, I realize we're now epic length, but my downloads from foreign trips episodes always turned to be epic length. The plan had been fly in, explore some places, as I mentioned, Tartus, Latakia, Aleppo, Idlib, and then drive north and leave from go across the Turkish border, go to a small airport in Turkey where we'd go to Istanbul, connecting flight back to the States. The Syrians were perfectly cool on their side of the border. Turkey would not allow us to go across the border into their territory. 2 Americans, 2 Brits. And those who know that I lived back in Turkey back in 2005, 2007, Turkey wouldn't allow me to enter the country. A little bit of irony right there.
Are you a wanted man over there? What happened?
So apparently when you're smuggling, this is the place you go. This is the road you do. Now, we're not smugglers. It also point out we went there 2 days before Ramadan started. So Ramadan's going on. You can't reach people the way you usually do. And this is the sort of thing where if we'd gone a different time, where we had different people on the other side of the border in Turkey, they might have said, "Okay, 2 Americans, 2 Brits. You're not causing any trouble. You're just going to the airport. Go on through." The people we were dealing with that night were adamant and sticklers, and my buddies are calling in every favor they possibly can from people in the U.S. government, from the Turkish government. No, I did not, for anyone wondering, I did not call in any of my friends in the U.S. government. I said to my buddies, "You got me here. You got to get me out of here. I'm not using any of my chits on this one." And it was not workable. But that's chits with a C. And it became clear we were not going to get out the border that way. We were not going to make our flight. We're not going to, and there's a part of me like, this is after 2 weeks, after being in not one, but 2 countries at war. or one at war and one that just finished a war. And we're like, okay, we're going to have to go back to Aleppo. We're going to have to stay in a hotel. We will drive south. And that is how I ended up going to Lebanon, which was not on the planned itinerary at all. So, Greg, remember in 2020, Mike Bloomberg was running for president, and everywhere you looked, there were ads, Mike can get it done?
Yes.
Well, that's kind of what Nasrallah signs are in Beirut. They're everywhere. Now, this is also like maybe a week and change after the funeral, where he was, I guess you could say, honored by an Israeli flyover, the Israeli Air Force, making, hey, we're in the neighborhood, just letting you know, we can bomb you anytime we want. We're driving straight to the airport. I know it's going to shock you, but because at one point, one of my buddies is like, well, we have an extra day in Beirut, it looks like, so we could, and I says, no bleeping way, get me to the airport. I love you guys. It's been great, but I want to get out of this place. I want to get back home. I miss my family. Poor Greg is going to have guest hosts for the rest of his life at this rate. Get me back there. And after that slightly tense moment, the decision was made, yes, we will go straight to the... So I've been to Beirut in the sense of driving through it to get to the airport. The Beirut airport does not have free Wi-Fi, which made it even tougher for me to reach home and say, hey, coming home a little later than I expected. But we flew out, connected in Istanbul, came back, and unforgettable trip.
Jim, this has been absolutely fascinating. So many other questions percolating in my mind, and I'm guessing that as events warrant over time, we can kind of reflect on this trip as the headlines come our way. But our listeners are thrilled you're back. I'm thrilled you're back. Most of all, Mrs. Garrity and your kids are glad you're back. And so I'm sure as events warrant, we can weave more and more of this into our martinis. But just absolutely fascinating to see, get your firsthand experience on what's going on in these two places.
It is great to be back. I just want to point out that I believe later this month, National Review Institute is hosting an Ideas Summit. So I'll put it to you, and maybe this would be an encouragement for people. Should I bring the vest and helmet to there so people could try it on? Because... otherwise, it's just kind of sitting around. So,
yeah.
I don't know. So, yeah. So, or next time you're over, you can try it on. And, it's kind of like, hey, have you worn an armored vest? Do you want to know what it feels like? So there you go.
Yeah. Charge them,
There you go. Exactly. A buck of wear, or just pennies before Trump gets rid of it. So
awesome. Jim, have an excellent weekend. You've certainly earned the rest, and I will talk to you on Monday.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Do subscribe to the podcast if you don't already. Tell your friends about it as well. You're not going to get content like this literally anywhere else. Find us and give us 5 stars and great reviews. This episode certainly deserves it. Hopefully they all do. In the meantime, get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. And also follow us on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Greg Corombos. Have a terrific weekend. Join us on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.